All right there. Let's see if I have some, so I've got some sound and we are recording, so good. This is the pre-recorded session that I promised everybody I would have for them this morning. And I wanted to just follow up while it's still in my mind and maybe rattling around in your brain as well. And we had talked about that we're going to be taking a look now at these four cases: relax, welty, Janders, and leisure. Now, we looked at the relax today, and this was the case there over in page 156 through 159 of the text. And just, and we'll do this. Take a look. Not Eli. Been that kind of a day. Let's search the book. Now, this was obvious. This is over in one of the files. And wanted to have one of the cases. Where in the world did that come from? Let's just go to chapter 4. In fact, I think it would help if I use the right book. So let's go find the right book. It's been one of these weeks. All right, there we are. We're in familiar turf. Let's search the book. We'll look for relax. And as I mentioned, we have the case there is followed on 156 to 159. So far. All right, as I mentioned, this is a media selection or media buy. And we walked through the case and we looked at their alternatives, number of potential customers reached. We talked about this case in some detail, so I don't know that there's really too much more that I would want to say, but I wanted to show you. I do actually read the book. I actually have the book. And the table here provides those data. As we walk through and start to identify an objective function in the variables, and of course here is the exposure quality. That's our objective function, and then the availability of media, the budget, and of course then those restrictions and the customers reached. So no need to look at that again. You could see I wanted to show you this because we're showing you this data from Lingo, and they're showing you the media availability, the budget, and give you some excellent narrative in terms of the outcome. Okay. Now, the second case that we were going to look at is welty. Okay, and I should have this Anderson student files here on my desktop. Let me see if I do. I thought I did. Oh, let's see, and I'll find them. Here they are. I actually do. How about those apples? And we're over here in chapter 4. And this is wealthy portfolio funds, and they start with the narrative there on page 162. As I note for you, it goes to page to 165. And again, this is just portfolio trying to get the best return at the lowest risk at the lowest cost. And so they've got some assumptions they start with in terms of their investments in various assets, and they want to maximize their rate of return using this mix. The percentage of the portfolio and these are the projected rates of return, and so we want to maximize this. Okay, and then the constraint, and they have some others that neither of these, steel or oil, will get $50,000. No, well, they will receive no more than 50 grand. So we're building in the constraints and the Pacific Oil constraint. And so you can see here we are. Here's the objective function. Okay. And it's subject to the following constraints. Now this shows us in the in that lingo application that the authors have, that the text website has, and you can see the optimal value and values for A through G, A, P, M, H, and G. We knew what those are, and no reduction in cost. So you can see we've got some dual values here. And as the authors mentioned, the optimum solution shows the dual value for the constraint 3 is 0. And we look for some slack or surplus. And as we see, there's no real, we have some slack or surplus value there. And we've got the 0 on these constraints. So those are binding. And this gives us the amount and the expected return. Okay. This is much like this is very much like the portfolio, the media buy. And I'm going to get the file open. Okay. And that's Wealthy Mutual Funds. You know, you'll remember over here at Hewitt, we had a similar situation. And all of these, we're using optimization. We have we want to maximize something or minimize it. We have constraints, usually in the form but it will always in the form of a budget constraint of some type. And we want to get the maximum bang for our buck. So we talked about Relax's media buy. And so now we're over here at Welty. Now again, the authors do a good job, fairly good job over in chapter 4, taking the case and providing us some really good narrative about the problem, especially in terms of the dual value, the slack surplus, And they start with variable 3 and talk about it. Okay. And as I mentioned there on number 3, which is the steel, it's got a slack or a surplus at 10,000. So again, where we're at now is not just taking a look at how do they get the objective functions, the variables to change, the constraints. Now we start to look at, okay, if I tweak this, what would I get? And you say, well, how would I tweak it? Well, we can look at slack at surplus values. We can look at dual values. And we can look at limit reports. And here's the expected value, the expected annual return, given the alignment. Now, let's take a look at the fund for just a minute. Because the text narrative is the authors do a good job with this case in terms of providing us some text narrative, but in reality, seeing this in the spreadsheet along with the text is exceptionally helpful for you. And here we've got the available funds for the investments. We've got some constraints on those that we can't go over 50 grand in terms of investing in oil. We can't go over $50,000. We can't go over 50,000 in terms of steel. We have these Boolean operators here. And the only one you'll notice is the pattern. And you'll notice the only one in which we can have a value equal to or greater than is government bonds. Now we see oil, a maximum amount on it, steel, a maximum amount on it, the Pacific oil maximum, and it's got to be, it can be equal to 30,000 or less, no more. So that we see that the anomaly of the government bonds. And the text provides us some narrative there about the government bonds. Now, each of these have their own levels of risk. The truth is, oil is a volatile commodity. Steel, same story. You notice that 2 of these are commodities. 3, it's oil and steel. And then we've got these government bonds. And so what it looks like that they're trying to do here is to use the portfolio to mitigate their risk, use an approach where they mitigate the risk by having a chunk of money into stable payout government bonds. You get an interest payment every month, or I think they're now semi-annual. Some of them are, others are annual, but you get your interest. And the bond is underwritten by a sovereign state, so there's a high probability, very, very low probability you won't get paid. And it's an interesting portfolio. These are people who are handling some pretty volatile commodities, but they're trying, of course, to keep that intact. Okay, we've got $100,000 available. Okay. And as you can see, each of our investments and we can have no more than $50,000 in steel 50,000 in oil. So notice here, we can have a maximum of $40,000 in steel. And here's Huber. And then we've got the government bonds. We chose not to put any money into Midwest Steel. And let's ask ourselves why. And again, this comes back to this tool is exceptionally powerful, but it's like anything that's powerful, you have to use it with great respect. And it's something that you need to make sure that you put the right figures in. The right figures being the very best available data that you can get. Anything else in your court disaster. And you'll hear me harp about this over and over and over. Now, if we had a track in management science, for example, one of those tracks would consist of primary data sources. Where would I get data on the return of these firms? If they're publicly traded, that's pretty easy in terms of what their growth will be. If they're privately traded firms, we have to try and develop a proxy of some type, and that becomes a little more problematic. And then the amount of funds. Now, just for kicks, we're going to take the available funds. All right, and instead of 100 grand, I'm going to give us 120. Now, we're going to take the additional $20,000. Okay. And we want the government bonds to be a minimum of 25%. Okay. So we're going to come down here, and for the government bonds, I'm going to make that 30,000. Remember when we had I'll just walk this back so we can see if there's a formula in there. We've just included these in. So we're going to go ahead, and we've got $130,000 to work with. 120. So the maximum of government bond, minimum of government bonds now would be 25% of 120,000. Which is 30,000. And so let's take a look at this. And have we done our math correct? Yes. Our Atlantic oil, 20 grand. Pacific oil accounts for, now we're at 50. Steel is at 40,000, and the government bonds are at 30,000. Now, in terms of these assumptions over here, or these constraints we've built in, we've got 120,000 bucks. We've got the maximum amount of oil we'll spend is 50,000, and it's between Atlantic oil and Pacific oil. Then we've got the maximum amount of money we'll put in steel is 50,000. but we only put 40 in. Why? Well, the math dictates that we use our government bonds minimum, and then we see the rate of return. Now this says at this point, as we put these data in, we've got a maximum total return of $8,900. Let's see about that. And so we'll go over here to the solver. And we'll solve. Okay. Now we have a solution. Now, I want to show you something that we had not looked at before. If you'll notice, over here on this button, this is why I like the Excel, is I can save the scenario. And we can call it $20 percent over 100K. And I'm just going to pretend it's 100. These are hundreds of thousands of dollars. And so, okay. And we can now do the reports on this. And let's go ahead and do the answer, the sensitivity, and the limits. And there's a sensitivity report, so we can take a look at them. Now we can do an increase in terms of government bonds, but the allowable decrease is exceptionally small. And then now for this, I think that for your purposes, since we're doing a maximization, it's the shadow price. And it shows us what we get for each additional unit invested. Now, when we look at government at the sell value, we find that it's a non-binding constant. Now, if you look at the others, available funds, that's a binding concept, constraint, excuse me. Same with the oil and the steel. And then the government bonds. Those are binding constraints, but we do have some flexibility with the government bonds. Let's go over and take a look for a moment at the limits report. And you can see and we can do a little bit of work with Midwest Steel. And you can see we've invested in Huber. So we have the limit and the result. These limits, think of them kind of like a standard deviation. I can go above or below that much. So when we look at the sensitivity here, and I look at the value at the shadow price, you could see that the figure that's got the highest is that we have, in terms of the oil, the maximum, but the shadow price, the one where we do have the ability to increase things a little bit, would be Pacific Oil. And that's really all there is to this. There's some good narrative in the text as they go dig into this a little bit further. Okay. Now, again, as I have mentioned, it's easy to get beguiled by these because they do appear to give you so much information. All right. The first thing is, where did you get the projected rate of return? If that's just garbage, you're going to get garbage in terms of the output. So you have to have some very, very good estimates. And this is really an exercise in forecasting. How good are these projected rates of return? Now, for me, ultimately, I think all of this is wonderful, but the one for me, I'm coming back and I'm going to take a look at the budget, that is the available funds, versus the total return. Now, in this scenario, okay, I spend 120 grand, okay, and I get a maximum total return of 9,200. So let's look at this. I'm just going to do a very simplistic return on investment. And we're getting a 7.667% return on our investment. We're getting about let's call it a 0.08. And I'll go ahead, I'm just going to round the decimals, so I'll go back home. And let's find that. Go back to the home tab. I want to get the I want it to show me. Oh, okay, here we go. Now, I'm going to stick with the protocol here in terms of the rounding. So we're rounding at two places in terms of the return. And I've optimized here, and I've got a return of 7.7%. In fact, I'm just going to click on that and make it a percent. Okay. And I'll go over and click on that, and then I'm going to copy format painter. Right. Now, if I put this 7.7% into perspective, I'm now ready to say, okay, what if I go back to the $100,000 that I originally had? And then the government bonds, the amount invested will have to be dropped. And I'm at 100,000, so it's got to go down to 10,000. Okay. We'll walk through this. And we have the constraints. And we'll go into the textbook for just a minute and take a pop in. Let's take a look at this. Okay. Now, here's something interesting. They're under the original constraints, their maximum return was $9,200, was $8,000. All right. So as I start to dig through this, okay. And my original was, and it was 8,000 invested. Pardon me, 8,000 return, over 100,000 invested. And you'll notice and we can go back and look at the original report, but notice something. We are getting a bigger bang. We are getting a higher dollar rate return, okay, as opposed to a percentage return. In this second go around, this, and here's the base case. Let's call this base, and let's call this base plus 1. Okay, this is our second iteration, and we've got a difference here. And if we look at this, the percentage return is less, but we are making $1,200. We spent $20,000 essentially to make $1,200. And that gives us, again, a return of investment of sorts. And that's about a 6% return. Now, let's do a base plus 2. And in this one, I upped the available funds from 100 to 120,000, and I'm going to do that again, 140. And the and so that's going to be 25%, which is it's going to take us to 35,000. So we're good. Now notice that our maximum total return on this one is we put in 140. Our return is 98.75. And that's going to equal as you notice, what's happening is we're making more money in terms of raw dollars but we're also increasing the amount of money. So the base gets bigger, then the percentages will get bigger. It's that simple. And it's easy to fool. But as you notice something, you'll see, and I'm going in increments of 20. Notice what's happening here. It's something very, very interesting. I'm going to increase the decimal. I'll decrease it. And I want you to notice, and I'm going to decrease this one, the decimal here. If you take a look at the base case, we're making 8%. At base plus 1, that is the second iteration, we're making 7.7%. We've gone down from 8 to 7.7, so we've lost 0.3%. Now, in terms of percentage return, now we've gone down 0.006, 0.6%. So while we're making more money, it's only because we're increasing the base. And notice what happened. Between the base case, and this is where sometimes you have to have some common sense. We had the base case, we made $8,000. And sure, here we picked up $1,200 by running base 1. But when I do base 2, that $1,200 return is almost cut in half. And this should be of the available funds. And I'm looking at this right now because I may want to mess with it a little bit here. I have 140. So I need to add another 5,000. And we have maximums. We can't put any more than 50,000 on oil, no more than 50,000 on steel. So those percentages are maxed out. And the government bonds are 35, so we're going to have to make them 40. So that they're equal. Now we see a maximum return. Let's see this. We're going to call this base plus 1. And now we put in 140,000. Our total return is 10,100. And that's going to equal at 7.2. So we've made $2,100 between base and base 1. So in base we're at 100 grand. We took it to 140, and you can see. Now, for me, this is probably about the best starting place. The sensitivity reports are fine. The limits reports are fine. But I would say that before you deep dive into them, I would just look at And I'm kind of playing some scenarios through here. Now, I have my limits on oil and steel. My commodity investments have limits. My investment in government bonds, though, there's a minimum amount. Okay, and what might have fooled you is what I just fooled me right there is I said, okay, it's 35,000. But but what we're saying here is that's the minimum, 25%. So I can go over that minimum. I can put more money into government bonds. Now, it's going to suppress my portfolio return for a simple reason. It's the lowest return. Now, it's also the lowest level of risk. So we spent $40,000. And so let's look at this just simply from a raw net gain. Net gain. Here's what we spent. And this would be plus 40. Now I put this in here. Okay. And we gained, and this is going to be $2,100. All right. So we spent $40,000 to make $21,000. And you can see the percentage return goes down, but it's going down because there's an increasing amount of money going into the government bonds. And so we might have to rethink some of these assumptions. So I want to take a few minutes and go through this case, this Welty case. And we're able to see, I don't even need to run the solver. I can just kind of play with it. The solver will work whether I generate the reports or not. I'm going to see it. Well, let's do this. And so let's look at our return on investment. 20,000 divided by oh, I don't want that. I gained over 40,000. And notice that when you go strictly with the increment, what we spent and what we gained, we spent $40,000 to make $2,100. Not a great return. And interestingly, it's 0.0525, which is very close to the government bonds. In fact, if you note, there's about an 8.0, there's 0.8% difference here between base and base one. And you can see the increment over here. Now, I'm one of these people that says if you want to really take a look at the sensitivity reports and all of that and see the limits, that's useful to you. But I always think if you want to just kind of work through some scenarios, this would be the way to do it. And you notice that we already had saved a scenario in Welty. So you can see the government bonds are, well, we're putting more and more money into our lowest performer. Of course, it's also the risk-free rate. And we probably wouldn't follow this lockstep approach to the portfolio. Okay, so there's something for you to look at in terms of Welty, and of course the case narrative, etc. And I'm not going to save these. You've got them recorded, and we kind of played around with them a little bit. Now, we've got the Janders case, and Janders is another one of those, and it's on pages 169 through 173. So let's go there, and I'll just do a search for Janders. Here we go. And they say an operations management application. This is one of the classic problems that we have. A make or buy decision, okay? Now, there is a law of economics out there called Coase's Law, C-O-A-S-E. Coase's Law stipulates that if it's cheaper for me to perform a function or handle a function internally, I will do so. If it's cheaper to have it outsourced, I'll outsource it. These costs, sometimes they'll use the term friction, okay? But Coase is pretty clear. He says if your payroll can be run out of ADP cheaper and than what you're doing to pay 10 people to do it, go see ADP. And we see this with all kinds of jobs, as in different labor markets, people will get a lower rate. You've got people making iPhones in China, I guess, I don't know what they make it. I think I've seen figures as low as $6 a day, all the way up to $12 or $13 a day. I'm hoping that Apple, with all of the attention they've gotten, has told Foxconn, which is their Chinese partner there, that large manufacturing facility. In fact, I think it's the largest in the world. They've told them, pay them what they would make in the States. So if they're doing that, you've got some people making some serious money. All that being said, we have a make or buy decision. Now, I'm involved in a project right now with a gated community out west of St. Louis. And this community, I was the executive director there for 3 years. And they have, I was like a city manager and a park superintendent. They have lakes and dams and marina and beach and RV campsite. And it's also like a little town or municipality. They have their own security. They have their own water service. And the part I've been working with them is their water system, which is aged to the point now that they have some serious decisions to make. And the decision they have to make is this: do we want to sell this water system, because they've got the county that surrounds them wants to buy the water system from them, or do we take out a note on the association's property and refurbish and fix and upgrade? This community has a substantial amount of land called lake lots and campground lots. And what that means is these are lots that are right up on the water, and building on them would be pretty prohibitive. You could, but you'll have some of those overlook the lake, but it's nothing but sheer granite below it, or the soil probably wouldn't hold. So they've deemed them fishing lakes. And every now and then we would have an auditors come out, and assessors, and they'd figure out the value of them. We've had a few people build on those, and they've had to spend a lot of money to build them. That's why they're called lake lots. Then we have what we call campground lots, or they had. And those are lots out near that are really just all over, primarily in the southern part of that HOA. And these are small, little tiny lots that you can pay $200 a year or something like that. You can buy them for $1,000 or $2,000. You pay the HOA fees at a reduced cost. and you have the right to come in and use the lakes, the dams, the marina, the beach. They have a clubhouse, you can rent it out, so you're a full member. So they're having a decision to make in terms of do we sell the water system, okay? So, and by doing that, we're essentially buying it now from the county that will take it over and says they'll fix it. They've laid a proposal that they'll fix it up, all this stuff, versus the community borrowing the money to build that water system. And it's a real emotional problem for them for a very simple reason. When the community was first started, it was an HOA. It was started by a real estate developer. This is a very common thing in HOAs. And eventually, the homeowners will take over from the developer because the developers made their money selling the land and having a deal on the side with people who have construction there. And now you're getting to the point where you've got people living out there and they want amenities, etc. And that's when the HOA, when the developer says, I'm in the real estate business, I'm not in the running a community business. Good to see you. God bless you and bye-bye. And in some places, the communities would buy capital items like roads, or they would buy water system, security system that the developer had put there. And in this case, the developer went belly up, and the community stepped forward and said, we'll settle a deal with you. And they were doing some outfit up in New York City, and the people said, fine. Now, at the time this happened, and this is in the middle 70s, this history tells me, they had 100 houses. Now there are, I think, close to 2,000 or 3,000 homes out there. Wouldn't they like to own it now? But the people there in that community love it because their water bill is $6 a month or something like that, maybe $12 or $15 in the summer when they run their hose, because they can sell it to themselves as cheaply as they want. So they have a classic make or buy problem. And I wanted to share that with you so that you could understand. These are the kinds of things that I deal with out in the real world, trying to help folks do some community service, etc. So I'm fairly current in it, and so you can be comfortable that I've been through a few of these. Well, the issue here, okay, now, and this is Janders. And you can see these are calculator components. And they're trying to ask, and they're trying to figure out, do they want to make them themselves or do they want to buy them from a vendor? Classic make or buy situation. And they give us components. And now if you see here at the top of page 371, we've got the objective function. We're in minimization mode. So I'm going to grab the Janders file. There it is. And we'll open it up. So by now, I hope that you're convinced that Solver is an exceptionally powerful and versatile tool. And I hope this is making an impression that, as I've continued to say, if you want to think like a successful business person, if you want to have some gear in your brain that turns your mind like that, okay, you have to see businesses in terms of their opportunity as this type of proposition. What do I want to achieve? I put that into some quantity, okay? What are my constraints? What variables do I need to change, or what are the key variables? And away I go. So let's look at this. Now they they have what it costs them to make or buy per unit the following components: a base, a financial cartridge, a tech cartridge, a financial top, and a tech top. And then over here, you see the demand for those products. And then you see the time available in hours. We've got 20 hours of regular time available and 50 hours of overtime. And the overtime cost per hour, we've got that price figured out. Okay. And then we come down to the model itself. And we want to minimize the overtime. Now we have 50 hours of it available, but we want to minimize it. Why? Well, here's an exercise in sensitivity analysis. Because overtime costs me more every hour. And unless I'm selling the product unless the product has a contribution margin, or let's say a gross revenue or gross profit per unit, gross profit per unit, great enough to handle the additional overtime, we're all happy. But if we're not, then we've got to do some work. And we'll look at this, and here we're going to try to minimize the cost with the amount of overtime used. And we see we have the manufacturing time. Now, we have to balance this issue of demand. And let's click on cell C17 and take a look. And here we're using the sum product of the following: B5 to C9, that array. You can see that over here in the cost per unit for a make versus a buy. Okay. And then B21 through C25. I'll come down here. And here they are. Make or buy. And that figure plus G12, which is the overtime, times B27, which ends up being the overtime used. And that's how we get that minimum cost. Okay. Now, we've seen what our cost is by minimizing it. Again, as I've said repeatedly, you've got to have good data to put into this model. These costs of make versus buy are going to be, this is the easy part. Running putting the mathematical model together is the easy part. The hard part is getting the right stuff to put in the model in the first place. And the even harder part, more difficult challenge, is looking at this and saying, what am I seeing? Is there a pattern? Is a sensitivity analysis going to tell me something? And your capacity to absorb that is going to be dependent primarily upon your experience. There's no substitute for it. And that's why you would know, if you have experienced people, they know these numbers. They understand them inside out. So we're trying to minimize these costs, and notice here we've got higher demand. So let's go in here for a moment and say, okay, I'm thinking of buying these. All right, I'm going to highlight these right here. Cells C5 through 9. C5 through 9. Now, we have the manufacturing time in minutes. So here's where, if I want to minimize costs, I go to work. the first thing is, if I'm thinking of buying these, I can go to my vendor in each case and I can say to them, look, I can make this stuff cheaper than you can sell it to me. Now, if you can sell it to me cheaper than I can make it, let's talk. Why? It's pretty simple. I reduce my cost structures. And this might be one of those situations where I'm dealing with a supplier with whom I have leverage. If you've not encountered it yet, you will. Porter's 5 forces model. And one of them is the relative power or advantage of a supplier versus your firm. Do they have leverage, or do you have leverage? If they're a single source supplier, they've got you. You better go find somebody else or be prepared to make it yourself. If you've got multiple sources, well, good for you. They're probably going to be of varying quality and varying levels of service, but you'll have some choices. So this type of model lets you say, okay, one place I might want to attack, what's the greatest disparity here? Okay, which of these has the largest difference? I'm talking about over here in the cost per unit. Well, I'm looking at the biggest disparity is the technical cartridge. That's 60 cents. And isn't it interesting? And I'm going to highlight this. And isn't it interesting, if we go further, that not only is it the greatest differential between what someone will what someone wants to sell it to. There's 60 cents difference between us making it and buying it from somebody else. It costs us 60 cents more a unit. Now, we got to remember that it takes 2.5 minutes to make it, this component. If those manufacturing time minutes are good, then we have to ask ourselves this question: is there a way I could reduce the manufacturing time and thus create a slack resource? And that'll be up to me and my decisions in terms of what I'm going to do. Now I can do this, and again, I can say, okay, now how else would I do this? Well, here's what I would do: is I take the manufacturing time in minutes, right? And now I have to talk about, all right, if technical cartridges take me 2.5 minutes, and notice something, there's only a 25% differential in terms of financial cartridges, but it takes me 3 minutes. Here are areas where that are just waiting for me to find them and do some work. Notice I pay a quarter more, but I save 3 minutes of manufacturing time. So for all intents and purposes, on a per unit basis, okay, and I'm assuming the manufacturing time in minutes is per unit. If I make it, I'm saving 25 cents. It costs me 8 cents a minute to make the thing. I save 8 cents a minute, okay, if I make it. Food for thought. If I come over here to the tech cart, well, you can see the difference. It's 60 cents. These are where I'm going to find some slack resources. This is where I'm going to find some hidden opportunities in terms of manufacturing time in minutes, in terms of the purchase time. And I'm driven by the availability of time. Now, they do give us a sensitivity report, and I'll leave you with that in the text narrative to take a look at. But for all intents and purposes, what we're looking at here is if I let someone else make it, all right, I pay a premium. Could I get someone to make it for me cheaper than what I make it for myself? There's a good possibility. You say, why? Why would someone do that? Simple. If they believe on a volume basis, this is not a batch situation, but I'm going to have a long-term relationship with this vendor, then for all intents and purposes, they can and should be able to use a learning curve. They should be able to use the law they should be able to get this cost spread out or minimized down to the point where they're doing continuous runs or long batch runs where the additional units produced are cheaper and cheaper and cheaper until I come to a point where it's counterproductive. So there's some room for me. So there's a little bit of wiggle room there for you if you wish to do it. Now, this can also be used in contracts and in analyzing and negotiating contracts. Well, I'll leave you with that in terms of food for thought. I think we've seen this is a pretty versatile tool. Now, let me just summarize. As we've looked at media buys, manufacturing some type of calculators. We've seen the versatility of this template, of this tool. But the bottom line is you've got to make sure, one, that the numbers that you put in are good. Okay, they're not junk. And number two, you need to step back, and the sensitivity reports that you're provided and the kinds of backup reports that say like Excel would give you or other commercial products are fine. But sometimes you want to just go back to the basics and say, if I change it, as we did in that earlier with Welty, what do I get on a per unit basis? Now, the sensitivity report will tell you that. And you want to ask yourself that. Now, if I thought, okay, for example, that let's take these two highlighted areas, the financial cartridge. If I thought that I could just go ahead and save the time, the 3 minutes, okay, and basically turn around and make something else for somebody else, I might be able to make a profit there. And if there are going to be times where, well, if I pay 60 cents more to my vendor, okay, great. They make 60. I'm paying 60 cents a unit more. But if I can go make a unit that I sell to somebody else, or maybe to that same vendor, but I'm their vendor at this point, and I can make 90 cents, I'm stupid if I don't buy it from them. And this is where sometimes when you want to have a strategic partnership, two manufacturers can mix or match and work things through. And they'll open up a little e-commerce store between the two of them so they know each other's inventory and they fill them. That's a strategic alliance. Okay, folks, that's pretty much it. I think you've seen how versatile the tool is, how we can use some common sense solutions in thinking about them and looking at them. And my goodness, we've gone from manufacturing cartridges, and we've gone from making calculators to selling time to a resort to media buy. You can see what a versatile tool this is. The best thing about it is it makes you start to think about your options. Well, this is the pre-recorded screencast I told you I produced for you. Here it is. Thank you much, and God bless you, and I will see you pretty soon.